A strange sister stole my fiancé and married him on our wedding day after meeting him just once. A year later, his mom called me crying with the truth. I'm 27 years old, and I've been through a lot, especially in the past year. I've faced things I never imagined I would, and I've barely had any support. But I've managed to rebuild myself emotionally and mentally, only for everything to fall apart in one night. Now, I don't know what to do, Doc. From a young age, my relationship with my family was always strained. I have a twin sister, Talia, and from the very beginning, it was clear that she was the golden child of the family. I don't know how twins can turn out so different, but that's how it was. I always thought the golden child was someone who excelled academically, had interests that matched their parents, or stood out in some way. But for us, it wasn't about those things. Talia and I were practically mirror images of each other. We shared the same interests, did well in school, and everything seemed to align. So, I could never understand why my parents favored her, though they tried to hide it at first. I remember when we were teenagers, I started to notice how much more attention Talia received. She never had to ask for anything, while I was always trying to earn their approval. It wasn't that they were outright cruel to me. It was more of an unspoken favoritism that I couldn't escape. They would always praise Talia for the smallest accomplishments, while I had to work twice as hard just to be noticed. As we got older, the situation didn't improve. Talia got the best opportunities, went to the best colleges, and everything seemed to fall into place for her. Meanwhile, I struggled to find my footing. It wasn't like I didn't try. I did. I just couldn't get the same kind of recognition. By the time I graduated college, I had already decided to distance myself from my family. I couldn't take the constant comparisons anymore. It felt like no matter what I did, I was always in Talia's shadow. It was hard to find my own identity when my family never seemed to see me for who I was, only for how I measured up to her. I thought leaving would solve the problem, but as it turned out, it only made things worse. When I left home, I thought I would finally have the space to define myself. But even then, I found myself trapped in the same pattern. Talia's life was constantly being discussed, while mine barely registered as important. Whenever we talked, the conversation always seemed to circle back to her achievements. I'd hear about how she was excelling at her job, how she had just bought a house, how she was dating someone new and wonderful. Meanwhile, I was stuck, unsure of what direction to take next. The tipping point came when my grandmother fell ill. I had always been close to her, so when she was diagnosed with cancer, it hit me hard. My family asked me to come home and help care for her, which I agreed to without hesitation. But when I got there, the dynamic had changed. My mother and Talia were already deeply involved in managing everything, and I was once again sidelined. They didn't need me, it seemed. They had it under control. I watched from the sidelines as Talia became the family's golden child, even more than before. She was the one who made decisions, who coordinated the care for our grandmother, and who received all the praise for her efforts. I was just a visitor, a peripheral figure in a family I barely recognized anymore. It felt as though no matter what I did, I couldn't win their approval, couldn't take up the space I needed to. The resentment began to build up, slowly but surely. I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. My feelings of inadequacy had reached their limit. I started questioning everything: my relationship with my family, my role in it, and my own sense of worth. Why was I never enough for them? Why was I always the afterthought? Then, one day, my mother asked me to help with something simple: buying groceries. I agreed, but when I returned, I found Talia had already done it. She was praised for her initiative, while my efforts went unnoticed. The feeling of being invisible, of never being good enough, overwhelmed me. That was when I realized something fundamental. I couldn't keep waiting for them to change. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own needs for their approval. It wasn't coming to. As the months passed, I slowly started to rebuild my life away from the shadow of my family. I moved into a new apartment and started working at a job that, while not glamorous, made me feel valued. For the first time in years, I felt like I was doing something for myself. My grandmother passed away, and though it was painful, I began to understand that my family's constant preference for Talia had nothing to do with me. It was about their own insecurities, their need to create someone they could hold up as perfect. It wasn't easy, but I eventually found the courage to stop trying to win their approval. I stopped comparing myself to Talia and began to focus on my own goals. I started therapy to help me untangle the years of resentment and self-doubt that had built up over time. It wasn't about hating my family, but rather about accepting that I didn't need to fit into their mold to be happy. Over time, I've learned to let go of the old pain, though it's still hard at times. I still struggle with the feeling that I'm not enough, that I don't matter to my family the way Talia does. But I also know now that I am enough. I am my own person, separate from the shadows they've cast. I don't have to compete with Talia or anyone else. I've come to understand that my worth is not defined by anyone's opinion, not even my family's. When I finally made the decision to confront my family about the way I had been treated, I did it not out of anger, but out of a need for closure. I didn't expect them to change overnight, and I knew it might not even make a difference in the long run. But I needed to be heard. I needed them to know how much their neglect had hurt me, and how I had spent years trying to fit into a role that wasn't mine. The conversation was difficult, as I expected. My mother tried to explain herself, but there was a lot of defensiveness. Talia, as always, played the role of the perfect daughter, the one who could do no wrong. But for once, I didn't care. It wasn't about them understanding me. It was about me understanding myself. I've come to terms with the fact that my family may never truly understand me, and that's okay. What matters now is that I'm no longer seeking their approval. I'm learning to accept myself, flaws and all. I don't need to be perfect, and I don't need to compare myself to Talia or anyone else. I am enough to. Looking back, I realized that my journey wasn't about seeking validation from others. It was about finding the strength to validate myself. And that's something no one could take away from me.